Вітаю. Починати буквально за хвилинку. Ні, я модераторка медіа-центру. Не знаю, організаторів можна спитати. Мікрофон треба. Говоримо мікрофон. Мікрофон включений.
July 26, Ukraine Media Center continues its operation. My name is Svetlana Shaprenko, and let me remind you that since now we work in cooperation with Tsymbaliuk in a comfortable community space called Urban Space 500, and now we will be talking about the way we can release Ukrainian medics from Russian captivity. And we're having this discussion for a reason, because tomorrow on the 27th of July, we celebrate the Day of Medic in Ukraine, so this topic is quite present. So let me introduce our speakers. Joining us online will be Andrii Kryvtsov, founder of the Military Medics of the Ukraine NGO. Joining us in this studio is Volodymyr Labuzov, head of the medical unit of the 36th Marine Brigade, who was released from captivity in December 22. Also joining us online will be Michelle Heisler, medical director of the Physicians for Human Rights NGO, professor of the University of Michigan, and Kateryna Amosova, cardiologist, doctor of medicine, member of the European Society of Cardiology. And also joining us in the studio are Andrii Yakovliev, lawyer and expert on international humanitarian law at the Media Initiative for Human Rights, and Victoria Tsymbaliuk, coordinator of family support projects at the coordination headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war. And I would like to start our conversation with Mr. Andrii Kryvtsov. I'm asking our technical team to get Mr. Andrii connected. And first of all, Mr. Andrii, can you please tell us about the number of Ukrainian medics currently being held captive in Russian prisons? Maybe we know anything about the conditions they're being kept in, and where, in which camps are they being imprisoned. Mr. Andrii, can you hear and see us? I'm asking the technical team to put Mr. Andrii on the screen. Good afternoon. I'm hearing you loud and clear. According to the information that we have. 1, 2, oh, we're hearing you. Can you hear me now? Yes, you're loud and clear. So, good afternoon once again. According to the information that we have, the information that our organization has, there are 46 medics being held captive by Russian Federation. We found out that information from their families. Since our organization is a small non-government organization, we understand that the number of such people may be even bigger. We may only talk about those information about whom is verified based on the reports from their family members. But we understand that the number of medics may be up to 500, both military and civilian medics who were captured by Russian Federation within the last couple of years. Also, we know that within the last 2 years, 78 medics, military medics, were released during the prisoner of war exchanges. So do we know what colonies are they being held at, and what are the conditions that they're staying in? Well, the geography is quite extensive. The territories of Russia and temporarily occupied territories, they are being constantly tortured. They are being kept in small rooms where they have to take turns to sleep. They are not being provided medical aid that results in serious physical and psychological injuries, damage of intestines, and different chronic diseases. Thank you, Mr. Andrii. We will be back to conversation with you a little bit later, and I would like to give the floor to Mr. Volodymyr. Mr. Volodymyr, you were being held captive by the enemy. Can you please share your story? Can you please tell us whether the attitude to you as a medic was more humane on part of the enemy? Well, good afternoon, everybody. I was being held captive from April to December year 2022, and I cannot provide any evidences about more humane attitude or more loyal conditions. I would say quite on contrary, the fact that I'm a medic was a trigger for them, for the employees of those institutions I've been held captive at. So in short, we were waking up at 6 o'clock. Then we were forced to sing the anthem of Russian Federation, or we were forced to listen to it through the radio, this anthem, and then we had to just listen to it. Then there was a morning inspection of personnel. We were taken out of our cells and influenced physically, so to say. So they were using clubs, their arms, their hands, their legs, and they were releasing dogs at us. Then there was something looking like a breakfast that does not satisfy any human needs. Then some of us were taken for interrogation or other activities. And basically, this is what was happening day to day. Beating was a mandatory procedure during the morning and evening inspections. As you can see, the quality of the food, I mean, you can judge about this quality looking at the pictures of the people before the captivity and after that. I've lost more than 20 kilograms as I was held captive. During the interrogations, we were accused of torturing the prisoners of war of Russian Federation, the membership in development of biological weapons in biolaboratories. So basically, in short, those were the conditions. Well, you've mentioned that when you said that you were a medic, it was an additional trigger for the Russian military. Well, they were accusing me of trade of organs of Russian prisoners of war. I was accused specifically of trading their sexual glands, and we were accused of not only being a medic, because they were saying if you're a medic, you were taking part in development of biological weapons, you know the whereabouts of the biological labs, and you know those Western professors who work in those biolabs. So what were the conditions? How did you end up in captivity, and have you been able to appeal to the international law? Well, appealing to the international law, well, it's not something that you can do, because as long as you stay in captivity, you're nobody. You're just a body. You're a toy in their hands. They can do anything to you. If they want to beat you, they beat you. If they want to have everybody in the cell to sin, Well, they were taking me by the hands, and for them it was just a pleasure to torture us. International law just does not exist in that territory at all. And for an umpteenth time saying something about any Geneva Conventions or anything, any standards of international humanitarian law, well, we were getting the same response. You're too clever, right? And then you get a club beating you, or a hammer flying your way, or a stool, or anything. Thank you for sharing your story, Mr. Andrii. We keep hearing it. We know that the law, whether it's international or any other law, does not exist for the Russians. And now we've heard yet another story that only corroborates this fact. But as a lawyer, can you please explain what are the articles of international law that Russians violate, holding the medics in captivity? Well, as the medics get imprisoned, it means the deprivation of medical aid of any civilians or the military. So when the Russians detain the medics, they act as if under the provisions that sometimes for the treatment the medics can be detained during the treatment of the prisoners of war. But this rule is obsolete. It's only related to the situations when in the battlefield, just like it happened during the previous wars when the Red Cross was established. I mean, Andrii Yakovliev, he'd seen 40,000 killed and wounded, so this is when they've come up with the idea that someone has to treat those wounded, and this is the situation that is set forth in the conventions. It says that medics cannot be held captive, and if they are being detained, only for the time that is required for treatment. But I want to emphasize that it has no legitimate meaning when the medics are deported to Russian Federation, because it happens in systemic manner. They are being held captive in different places. It means that somebody organizes this policy, and it would be just unreasonable to say they don't know that the medics were detained. So when the medics are detained and held captive for a long time, it means that they are deprived of their freedom, and deprivation of freedom is a war crime. And when we're saying that they were deprived of their freedom on a large scale, systemically, with the use of tortures on par with other citizens, we can describe it as a crime against humanity. And it's not just the violation of the laws of war. I want to emphasize that one of the tasks of the international law is to mitigate the consequences of war, and the mitigation of such consequences is treatment of sick and wounded. And when such crime is committed, at the same time other crime is committed, in fact, because the medics cannot provide medical aid anymore. And we have to clearly realize it. We have to make sure that in future we can count on criminal cases in international criminal courts, the arrest warrants not only for the performers of the crime, but also for the organizers on a federal level, which would mean that ICC does not only influence their punishment, but also their behavior, because it in future may reduce the sufferings of all the prisoners of war, including medics. So I would say that it's the war crime, to say the least, but it can also be classified as a crime against humanity. And when you say that the international law doesn't work for Ukraine, I have to tell you that from evolution standpoint, the international law always works. It was invented very long ago that the medics are protected, and it endures, this rule endures centuries. It means that the truth will prevail. So we have to just think whether international law is just a hollow sound. We just have to think about how to expand the territory where the rulings of international courts will be fulfilled. If there are countries where if there are no countries where such laws don't work, there will be no reason to violate such law. Thank you, Mr. Andrii. So what are the ways to bring the imprisoned medics back home? Who is involved in this process on part of Ukraine and on part of our international partners? Well, I cannot tell you about everything. I can only tell you about what I see. Well, we have to have this understanding. We have to discern this fact that Russia does not only hold prisoners of war captive, but also the medics. And in the international level, we have to understand that they are illegally deprived of their freedom. As soon as there is such a realization, there should be a logical reaction, logical response. And this response is in violation of certain cases. And then we have to seek the fulfillment of those rulings by the majority of the countries. We have to advocate it. It doesn't necessarily mean that right after that the medics are going to come back, but now we don't have it at all. And should we achieve that level, that would be a whole different level of influence. But from the government standpoint, the state has to exercise diplomatic pressure and to mention that there are violations that break the system of international law. And first of all, we have to pay attention to them. Thank you very much. So talking about the support of international community, we would like to talk to Ms. Michelle. Whoever needs translation, please use the simultaneous interpretation devices.
Hear us?
Hello, Mrs. Michelle, can you hear us?
Can you hear us? Are you with us? Can you join the conversation? Yeah, hi. Tell us, please, how does the international community... Технічна команда у нас...
Yes, hello.
Yeah,
yes,
hi.
sorry, I'm listening on YouTube.
Yeah, so...
Yes, hi. Oh.
Yeah. My question is, how does the international community fight and puts pressure on Russian Federation regarding the release of Ukrainian medics?
Yes, I can. Dobry den. I'm happy to represent the International Human Rights Organization, Physicians for Human Rights, at this very, very important press conference. Again, as Mr. Yakovliev emphasized, and as we heard from others, just physicians, medics, other healthcare workers in times of war are critically important. Combat medics on the field save the lives of soldiers and others who would have died in battle without their immediate interventions. Physicians, nurses, and other clinicians in towns and cities under attack treat immediate injuries while they continue to provide life-sustaining care to all under dire circumstances. It is, I myself am a physician, it is the professional obligation of all healthcare workers to provide healthcare to all who seek it, regardless of their patient's political affiliation, nationality, religion, ethnicity, or other characteristics. And as Mr. Yakovliev emphasized, one of the worst crimes thus under international humanitarian law is to target healthcare facilities and to persecute medics and other healthcare workers for meeting these obligations to provide impartial care. And one thing I also want to underscore is that impartial care and the protection does not mean that the clinician may not take a side or even be in the military that is fighting on one side of the war. Those medics are equally protected. A central tenet of international humanitarian law is that those who are exclusively engaged in providing some kind of medical assistance, whatever that is, whether it's direct treatment, carrying medical supplies to the wounded or sick, are considered to be medical personnel. And again, this regardless of whether they are members of the armed forces are not. So all countries of the world, all countries, including Ukraine and Russia, have signed the Geneva Conventions. They are obliged to respect this universal right of medical personnel not to be attacked or held as prisoners of war, and as we heard, horrifically tortured and mistreated by Russian forces. The HR, who I represent, is among those organizations with partners here on the call that has helped to document the many ways Russian forces and officials have violated this universal right. Since the onset of Russia's full invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there have been some 1,500 direct attacks on Ukraine's healthcare facilities, workers, and medical infrastructure. This has amounted to about 2 attacks per day. And again, as we have heard very movingly today, Russian forces and officials have detained and arrested hundreds of healthcare workers trying to meet their duty to provide healthcare. Healthcare workers, including medics, as we're focusing on here, are among many other prisoners held by Russia and that return from captivity reporting being tortured, having really unbelievably poor living conditions, which is also a violation, and ill-treatment. And I think others on the call may talk about, we know that the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine documented widespread practices of torture and ill-treatment in places of internment in the Russian Federation and in Ukrainian territory that Russia is temporarily occupying. And again, like the testimony we heard today, this is consistent with testimonies of doctors and medics held in captivity at the Russian-controlled correctional colonies. And again, we also are working to document this together with partners, thanks to the testimony of medics. And also very important that we can do Istanbul protocol-based medical legal evaluations, of the psychological and physical scars that many of these continue to have that further corroborates their claims of torture. So I know journalists on this call, other organizations, the testimony is important. And it's really important that we as physicians who are working to help combat medics and others, that we join in and get the necessary training and really help to conduct and provide the medical legal evidence that can further help in accountability so that perpetrators of these crimes can be held accountable. We in Physicians for Human Rights, along with many other international human rights organizations, are working with you side by side. Please know you are not alone. We're trying to mobilize support, and we're trying to mobilize support from the medical and health communities of countries throughout the world to put pressure on the UN, to work with international accountability mechanisms, also universal jurisdiction. There are many countries that can work to try perpetrators of crimes. So again, we are working with you to ensure that the media, public attention, governments, international bodies continue to document, to work to stop, to ensure accountability for these crimes and to help those medics still imprisoned to achieve both their freedom and accountability for what they've suffered. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Michelle, for your answer and for your support. Я прошу нашу технічну команду знову приєднати до нас пана.
I'm asking our technical team to get Mr. Andrii reconnected to us. I know that he had some remark he wanted to emphasize, so we're waiting for Mr. Andrii on air. Mr. Andrii, the floor is yours. Can you hear us? We can hear and see you. Well, the task of the medics is to relieve the suffering, but they are being tortured for fulfilling their professional duty. Meanwhile, the medics are protected by international law, Russia continues keeping them in captivity. And at least 340 combat medics were killed by Russia within the last 2 years. Our organization currently has 46 medics on our list. However, this number is a lot bigger. I mean, those who are being held in captivity. 78 combat medics were released from captivity under prisoner war exchanges. Last year, coordination headquarters and MFA and our organization had a briefing for the representatives of international organizations in Ukraine, and those present at the briefing were evidencing about the killing, tortures, and other forms of inhumane behavior that the Ukrainian medics are experiencing in captivity. The conditions of detention in Russian prisons are terrible. The imprisoned medics are being electrocuted and severely beaten. Everything that was mentioned before. Russia continues violating the articles of international law, keeping Ukrainian combat medics and civilian medics hostages. It requires to be condemned by international community. We've already provided all of the information to international organizations asking for their support. We've also were addressing WHO. They expressed their concerns, and on the third day of their concerns, Russia inflicted missile strike on the Children's Hospital of Ohmady. This is why we're urging all of the medics. We ask you to be the ambassadors of imprisoned Ukrainian medics all around the world. We're asking you to support the sanctions against Russian Federation so that they're imposed and spread in the international platforms. The boycott of Russian medics in international conferences. As long as Russian medics continue taking part in such activities, their Ukrainian colleagues are being held in terrible conditions, being tortured. It creates paradoxical situation when Russia gets support in the medical field, violating the medical ethics themselves. We also ask you to support the import of all of the medicines except for those urgent to Russian Federation. Such activities would emphasize that it's not right to decorate the faces of Russian medics. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian ones are being tortured. Then we ask for suspension of funding of Russian medical institutions. Then international medical community is supposed to condemn the activities of Russia and to increase the diplomatic pressure to stop the violation of international law. Ukrainian medics fulfill their patriotic and professional duty, staying by the side of the wounded ones until the very last moment. This is why we're asking all of the global community to take decisive measures to release our medics from captivity. It requires immediate response on part of the international community. Thank you, Mr. Andrii. I'm asking our technical team to have Ms. Kateryna connected to us. So we're waiting for Ms. Kateryna online. Ms. Kateryna, good afternoon. Can you hear and see us? We're not hearing you. Can you please switch your microphone on? Well, now we're hearing you loud and clear. Good afternoon, Ms. Kateryna. Good afternoon, Ms. Moderator. Good afternoon, dear community. This, so to say, Day of the Medical Worker, in my opinion, is not so much of a holiday, but rather a day when we can draw everyone's attention to the condition of medics in Ukraine. And it's not so much about Facebook greetings and awarding, but as the previous speakers have mentioned, it's yet another day when we can draw everyone's attention to our colleagues who stay in inhumane conditions, who fulfilled and overfulfilled their professional and human duty. They were doing something that the majority of us would not have been able to do. Now our colleagues require our help. They require our voices. They require our votes to support the initiatives aimed at their immediate release. I was humbled to hear those figures from Mr. Andrii that 78 colleagues were able to come back home. Obviously, 46 prisoners is definitely too small of a figure. It cannot be true because the information is not sufficient. The number of our colleagues who are being held captive is way bigger. Also, just think about 340 colleagues who perished in the front lines. I personally know two of them, Mr. Serbin and Mr. Yevgen Beshlyag. Every single Ukrainian medic knows at least a couple of those, at least one of those who perished in the front lines. So we have to take our best efforts. We have to continue reminding the global community that to make sure that the number of those who fell victims to the war, that it does not increase, to bring more of them back from captivity. So I want to join the civil organizations of our Ukrainian colleagues, our foreign colleagues, the organizations of families of imprisoned medics, urging everybody to be reminded about those who've taken their best efforts to help the Ukrainian military and civilians in those territories where they were fighting for freedom of Ukraine. Once again, I want to thank the armed forces and glory to the heroes. Mr. Andrii said that Ukraine needs ambassadors who will carry this idea throughout the world, who will spread the idea of boycott of Russian Federation in all platforms. Are you ready to become an ambassador like this, to have more of a global community engaged in initiatives like this? I personally am ready to continue reminding that our imprisoned colleagues are supposed to be brought back the soonest possible, because I think this is the most important and the most real thing that we can do. Then after they come back, I see there is a lot of work on the way on documenting of the conditions they ended up in, about all of the crimes that were committed in their relation, to then return to investigation of those crimes. But first of all, those are the human fates, the fates of the colleagues and their families who live with this for the last 2 years. Thank you, Ms. Kateryna. So let's get back to our speakers in the studio. Ms. Victoria, so what is the work that the coordination headquarters is doing to release the imprisoned medics, and are they segregated as a dedicated track? Well, first question, what is being done by the coordination headquarters? We have 3 main categories. We work on saving the lives of the people in captivity, then return of our prisoners of war, and we also seek punishment of the perpetrators guilty of war crimes, including those who are responsible for holding Ukrainian medics captive. Talking about the combat medics, as it was said by my colleagues, I can confirm it that the combat medics are supposed to be returned return to Ukraine, and it shouldn't be happening as an exchange. There should be no hesitation. There should be no waiting until the end of the war, of aggressive war of Russia against Ukraine, because our medics who ended up in captivity, first of all, they are supposed to be protected by the rights of the prisoners of war. Then they're supposed to be protected by Geneva Conventions as doctors, as medics, and then they are protected. They are supposed to be protected, but in fact Russia does not comply with those rules. However, in the global community, they are protected against violent abductions. The families present here, they've done a colossal job with our government agencies in terms of search of information about where their relatives are. They keep searching on a daily basis. They talk to each other. They continue looking for more and more ways to find information and to identify the whereabouts of their family members. So according to the international humanitarian law, if a Ukrainian medic ends up in captivity, Russia is supposed to report Ukraine, to notify Ukraine through ICRC that they have such a person held captive, and after the medics provide medical aid to their brothers-in-arms, and I have to emphasize it that our Ukrainian medics were providing medical aid even to the Russian military while staying in captivity, and we know about such facts. We have them documented, but unfortunately Russia does not take into account that fact. But the fact that the medics are staying in some remote regions where they cannot use their professional skills, well, I'm not even talking about saving lives. I'm talking about medics being tortured, and it creates risk for their lives. So basically, people fulfilling their duties to save the lives of others are being tortured by Russian Federation, which is unacceptable. The facts of such inhumane behavior, not only in Ukrainian society, not even among the medics, should educate full intolerance to such cases, to every single case when not only the rights of medics are violated, but human rights in general, crimes against humanity, Russian attacks of the medical institutions, storage facilities, educational institutions, professional medical educational institutions. The topic of medics held in captivity should not be tolerated by the society, and international community plays a key role in this process. So just like we were urging before, we are supposed to counter Russia in the international platforms, to boycott the participation of Russian medics in different forums and suspension of any support provided for them. We should educate intolerance to any expression of inhumanity. There are representatives of the families in this studio. There are representatives of civil organizations fighting for the rights of the medics who are being held captive. Also, thanks God, we have one of the medics who was released from captivity, who was providing evidences, and we really appreciate the fact that you can describe this problem. Well, basically it's a catastrophe, because the problem is not the right word to describe this phenomena. So we believe that justice will come. There will be just punishment for the crimes, but we remember that human resources are limited, and we don't have a lot of time to put together some large-scale plans. We have to start acting now. We have to develop this, to educate this intolerance right now. We keep working on the return of our prisoners of war, on the return of the medics. We're saying that the medics are supposed to be repatriated right here and right now. We're saying that there are countries which are ready to accept the combat medics and civilian medics. If Russia cannot return them to us, let them return them to the third countries. And thanks to a joint effort, there is no single country who would be unaware of such problem. I mean, the problem with the prisoners of war, with the medics being held captive by Russia, and thanks to the cooperation between the state, the family members, with those who were released from captivity, with you as a journalist community, because you highlight this problem in the resolution of the peace summit. The third article was our humanitarian mission, and it's our merit that it's in the third position. It's important because saving their lives, generally human life, is of the highest value. This is why the urge to continue our fight is still on. Nobody is giving up. We continue fighting for return of our prisoners of war, for return of the medics. And this topic today is dedicated to the combat medics specifically, and we continue emphasizing that they are supposed to be repatriated now, because the time they've spent in captivity, it shouldn't happen according to all human rules. And the persons holding them captive are supposed to be punished. Thank you, Ms. Victoria. Maybe journalists have any questions to our guests. If you have any, please proceed to asking them. Hello, Stanislav Miroshnichenko, Media Initiative for Human Rights. I'm having a question to the representative of the combat medics. Can you please tell us, as you were held captive, have you ever seen any representatives of ICRC? And then a question to the representative of coordination headquarters. Do you cooperate with the representatives of ICRC? And then another question. If you're talking about some third country, what country can it be? Thank you. Thank you for your question. So let's start answering with me. During my time in captivity, I haven't seen any single representative of International Committee of Red Cross or representatives of any other international organizations. Not a single time. At least there where I've been held captive, and no single prisoner there, no single prisoner of war had come across any representative of any international organizations. So talking about the cooperation of coordination headquarters with ICRC and third countries, so International Committee of Red Cross, their mission is first of all to establish the dialogue between the countries in terms of information exchange about the prisoners of war. They are supposed to be provided access. They're supposed to be provided an opportunity to check their health condition and to be able to see a prisoner of war at all times, to keep track of their health condition, so that they're able to provide medical aid at any moment when it's necessary. But as it was just witnessed, there were no cases of communication between our prisoners of war and the representatives of ICRC, or such cases are infinitesimal compared to the total number of infinitesimally small compared to the total number of the prisoners of war. So in Ukraine, ICRC has access to all of the prisoners of war held captive by Ukrainians, as is guaranteed by by Geneva Convention. That's why the answer Well, talking about this third country, Ukraine has announced that we are ready to consider any third country for repatriation. Every country is made aware of it, that we would like to see them as participants of this process. So as soon as any country announces their readiness to do so, Ukraine also considers such opportunities, and we start working on them immediately. The microphone, please. So basically, no single country has expressed any interest in repatriation of medics as a specific category of prisoners of war. So talking about repatriation of the medics, yeah, for what I know, there was no such expression of readiness specifically with regard to medics. So if any countries have desire and political will that we hope for, just like our medics, all of our prisoners of war hope. So we hope that such political will appear, will emerge. So basically, I want to emphasize that it was not only that my colleague who had such experience, that it's a systemic practice of Russian Federation. We don't know whether their confirmations are real or not, but I'm having a question to my colleagues, whether you had an opportunity to write like 2 letters per month as is guaranteed by Geneva Convention, and have you been able to receive meals in an amount that would prevent you from losing weight? Thank you. It's an important question, really. Of course, we had no right for correspondence, for telephone calls, let alone talking about 2 letters per month. That's fantastic. And from my experience, I can tell you that we were once forced to write letters home. A lot of guys, including me, were rewriting that letter from the standard approved by the employees of that confinement facility. Every case of rewriting was accompanied with beating. Just I, for example, had to rewrite my letter 3 times until it was coordinated with them, and we were writing that letter somewhere in the end of July, and it only reached my family in the month of November 22. Thank you, Mr. Volodymyr. I think that it's quite an eloquent period to today's briefing, and we hope that as much medics as possible come back home the soonest possible, and those who illegally hold them captive will be properly punished. So let me remind you, we were talking about the ways we can seek release of our medics from captivity, and Ukraine Media Center will continue on Monday. Thank you for staying tuned. Glory to Ukraine.
Андрій, представник офісу роботи, який став питання, там є
Все ж таки хотілося одне запитання, що я можу поставити. Пане Володимире, до вас, а у вас є коментар. Цікаво.